Down there, life continues. The traffic is awful, stocks go on trading, and Star Trek is still showing.
Good day, grade 8 learners. Welcome to today's natural science lesson. My name is Papichanda Singo, and this lesson is partly brought to you by the Department of Education. In today's lesson, we're going to be learning under the novel experience, life and learning. The topic is interactions and interdependence within the environment. And the subtopic is energy flow, food chains, and food webs. Now let's go through the lesson objectives together. So at the end of the lesson, you should be able to define energy flow, analyze energy pyramids, define a food chain and food web in an ecosystem, and describe a food chain and a food web. All this is sourced from the CAPS document from page 37 to page 38. All right, now let's move on to pre-knowledge. So this has laid the foundation for today's lesson. If you remember, in grade 5 and in grade 6, we were introduced to the concept of an ecosystem and feeding relationships. And so far in grade 8, we have been learning about ecosystems as per last week's lesson. Now let's move on to the baseline activity. I'll read out the questions for you and then we will do the solutions together. Question 1 reads, state the name of an organism that feeds on plants. Number 2, blank are organisms that eat flesh, in brackets, meat only. Number 3, state the relationship between a leopard and a rabbit. Number 4, in the relationship between a shark and a seal, the shark is a blank. The shark is a blank. I'm going to give you 4 minutes to answer these questions. Then after 4 minutes, we will do the solutions together. See you after 4 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. Don't forget to send through your answers or any questions that you may have to the WhatsApp number on 079 Don't forget to send through your answers and solutions. Now, the first question read, state the name of an organism that feeds on plants. State the name of an organism that feeds on plants. It is a herbivore. Blank are organisms that eat flesh or meat only. Carnivores. Carnivores are organisms that eat flesh only. State the relationship between a leopard and a rabbit. A leopard and a rabbit, it is a predator and prey relationship. The leopard is the predator and the rabbit is the prey. So the predator hunts the prey for food. And then number 4, in the relationship between a shark and a seal, the shark is a blank. The shark is a blank. The shark is a predator because the shark hunts the seal for food. The shark hunts the seal for food. Here is another predator and prey relationship. So take 1 minute to copy down the corrections quickly, then we'll continue with our lesson after 1 minute. Welcome back. Now let's move on to terminology. The first term is producer. The first term is producer. What is a producer? It is an organism that makes its own food. It is an organism that makes its own food. And a consumer, it is an organism that obtains food from plants either directly or indirectly. Decomposer, it is an organism that breaks down the remains of dead plants and animals. Dead plants and animals. Herbivore, it is an organism that feeds on plants only. It is an organism that feeds on plants only. A carnivore is an organism that feeds on other animals only, so it eats flesh only. Then an omnivore, this is an organism that feeds on plants and animals, on plants and animals. And then an insectivore is an organism that feeds mainly on insects and small invertebrates. Insects and small invertebrates. So more on terminology. A scavenger. A scavenger is an animal that feeds on dead animals. A predator is an animal that hunts for food, so it hunts other animals for food. Prey is that animal that is being hunted by a predator, an animal that is being hunted. And then trophic level. Trophic level, this is a feeding level on the pyramid, a feeding level on the pyramid. And then food chains. Food chains is the sequence of transfers of matter and energy in the form of food from organism to organism, from organism to organism. Then food webs, a complex network of interconnecting and overlapping food chains showing feeding relationships within a community. Showing feeding relationships within a community. Now let's learn about the flow of energy. How does it work? How does the flow of energy work? Now, the flow of energy from the sun to different organisms in an ecosystem is very important. Why is it important? It is important because it supports the life process of living organisms. Remember when we're learning about photosynthesis and respiration and how these two processes are very important in the 7 life processes of living organisms. So, the sun
is the main source of energy. So the energy that flows from the sun to different animals at different levels is very important for support of their life processes. Now, if we look at the sun here, there is the sun and the red, right? In this red box, the yellow arrows represent the flow of energy, how energy is moving from its main source. So we get all our energy from the sun. Then from the sun, the plants are able to harness that energy or capture that light energy. Then that energy further moves to your consumers, primary consumer, secondary consumer, and decomposers. So that energy is moving from one organism to another, supporting their life processes. So energy transfer, we have figured out that it is vital. Vital means it is very important to carry out life processes. So all the energy in food webs and food chains comes from the sun. It is the ultimate energy source. It is the ultimate energy source. If we look at this diagram here, so this is number one. This is number one. That's step number one. It is where all the energy comes from. It's where all the energy is sourced from. So it's where all the energy comes from the sun. Then from the sun to the producer, from the producer to the consumer, which is the grasshopper, from the grasshopper to the frog, from the frog to the snake, the hawk, and the fungi. If you look, these arrows are pointing towards where the energy is going. So the energy from the producer goes to the grasshopper. So that's why the arrow is pointing in that particular direction. So plants are able to trap sunlight energy during photosynthesis. Remember, those green plants and other organisms that are green are able to trap energy from the sun during photosynthesis, and then they convert it to chemical potential energy in food compounds that are available to animals. So after the producer produces its own food, then that energy from the sun has now been converted to chemical potential energy that is then stored in the food. Then what happens next? Here comes a herbivore. The herbivore gets that energy directly from the plant. So the herbivores, these are the animals that feed on plants only, and they get their energy directly from the plants. The carnivores then eat other animals. So they eat other animals for energy. Omnivores, they eat both plants and animals for energy as well. And this energy transfer is represented in what we call food chains. It is represented in food chains. That is where the flow of energy is represented. So what is energy flow in a food chain, or what does energy flow in a food chain look like? Now, food chains show the feeding relationships between living organisms. We've already learned in our previous lesson, we learned about the producers, we learned about the consumers and the different types of consumers that exist: the herbivores, the carnivores, the omnivores, and the decomposers. Those are your heterotrophs, the consumers. So the food chain highlights, or rather it shows us what that feeding relationship in that particular environment looks like. So energy is passed through an ecosystem along what is called a food chain, from the producers all the way to the consumers, So here I have a simple food chain. With our energy source, producers, which are our autotrophs. These are the ones that photosynthesize and make their own food. From there, the herbivore eats the autotroph and gains energy from the autotroph. So now the energy has flown from the autotroph to the herbivore. That is why the arrow is pointing towards the herbivore. The herbivore is going to be eaten by the carnivore. In this particular case, we have a lion. See, the arrow is pointing towards the carnivore. So energy has flown from the herbivore all the way to the carnivore. That's where the energy has gone. And then through droppings, now the decomposer, which is our dung beetle there, decomposes any organic material or any organic matter that is in the droppings of the carnivore, recycling the nutrients back into the ecosystem. So this is a typical food chain. It shows you from start, it shows you the producer, it shows it in this particular case we got the source of our energy, it shows you the producer, it shows you the herbivore, it shows you the carnivore, and the decomposer. That is a typical food chain. So now let's do this activity together. Right, use the diagram to answer the following questions. Now we've got grass, grasshopper, rat, and owl. Question A, what can we call this diagram? Question B, which organism is the producer? C, which organisms are the consumers? D, the rat also eats seeds. Therefore, what do we call the rat? Give a reason for your answer. So I'm going to give you 5 minutes for this activity. Then after 5 minutes, we will do the solutions together. Welcome back, grade 8. Now let's go through the corrections together. Don't forget to send through your answers and any questions that you may have to our WhatsApp number on 079 2908. Use the diagram to answer the following questions. So there's the diagram that had a grasshopper, a rat, and an owl. So the first question read, what can we call this diagram? This diagram, it is called a food chain. It is called a food chain. Why? It is showing us the feeding relationships between animals that live in possibly one ecosystem, and it is also showing us the flow of energy from one organism to the next, and to the third, and also to the fourth. So this is a food chain. It is showing us the feeding relationships between living organisms that are living inside a community, and it is showing us the flow of energy, the direction of flow of energy amongst the organisms. And now, of these organisms, which one is the producer? Is it the grass? Is it the grasshopper? Is it the rat? Or is it the owl? Now, you need to ask yourself, what do I know about producers? Producers produce their own food. They make their own food, and they're capable of doing so because they can photosynthesize. Now, of these four organisms, which one is most likely to be the producer, or which one can photosynthesize? This would be the grass. The grass is the producer because it photosynthesizes, it produces its own food. It produces its own food. Now, next, B, which organisms are the consumers? Which organisms are the consumers? What is a consumer? A consumer is an organism that cannot make its own food. It cannot photosynthesize. It cannot photosynthesize. So from these four organisms, which ones are most likely to be the consumers? These are the grasshopper, the rat, and the owl. These three are not capable of photosynthesizing or making their own food. They are not capable of making their own food. Now, D. The rat also eats seeds. Where's the rat? Here's the rat. It also eats seeds. But in the food chain, it is seen to eat the locust. The locust is surely not a seed. It is a consumer. So therefore, what do we call the rat? And give a reason for your answer. We call the rat an omnivore because it eats both seeds and animals. A grasshopper is labeled under animals. It is under animals. So the rat is an omnivore. It eats both plants and animals. It is an omnivore. Now let's talk about the trophic levels. Let's talk about the trophic levels. Now, there are three different consumers. There are three different consumers. Now, one, we have what are called primary consumers. We have what are called primary consumers. These are animals that eat plants. What does that remind you of? It reminds you of the herbivores. There is our primary consumer, and then we've got secondary consumers. Secondary consumers, these are animals that eat the primary consumer. So that is your secondary consumer. The frog is now eating that locust that was busy eating the leaf there. So we have our secondary consumers, and then we have what are called tertiary consumers. Tertiary consumers, these are the animals that eat the secondary consumers, and in this particular case, the snake is the tertiary consumer. So we have the grasshopper being the primary consumer, the animals that eat plants. Then we have the frog, which is a secondary consumer. It feeds on locusts and other small insects. And then we have the snake. The snake then eats the secondary consumer. It feeds on rats, it feeds on frogs. Those are the kind of animals that snakes feed on. Those are the kinds of animals. So each stage inside of a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. it is called a trophic level. So each stage each stage or step in a food chain or a food web is called a trophic level. Now let's learn about energy transfer and energy lost. Energy is bound to be lost when it's flowing from the sun to the plants to different animals. Now let's talk about how it is transferred and how some of it may be lost. An organism uses up to 90% of its food energy to itself for life processes. So when an organism obtains food, what does it do? When an organism obtains food, it uses 90%, that's a huge portion of its food, to its life processes. Now there's a remainder there. There's the 10% that remains. So about 10% of its energy goes to new body cells available for the next animal when it gets eaten. So it's going to use 90% for its life processes and then keep 10. Remember we learned that when we're learning about photosynthesis and feeding relationships, that a plant will produce its own food, it will produce glucose, store the rest. When the herbivore comes and eats that plant, it is going to use some of the energy that it got from the food. So that energy is the 90%, and then store the 10% in form of carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. And then once the carnivore comes and devours that animal, it is literally taking that 10%. So here is a picture just to show you between primary producers and primary consumers. So here, when the producers produce their food, they will use up to 90% for life processes and keep the 10%. Then there's going to be 10% energy transfer to the consumer. The consumer uses 90% of that energy that has been transferred and keeps the 10% for its body cells. Then when the secondary consumer consumes the primary consumer, it's consuming that 10% that has been stored, and then it uses that 90% of that 10% for its life processes and stores 10. Then that 10 is then transferred to the tertiary consumer. So that is how the energy flows, or that is how the energy is transferred from one consumer to the next. So remember, we said each stage in a food chain is called a trophic level, and energy transfer and energy loss are bound to happen at each level, at each trophic level. So energy pyramids are an important tool that are used to represent the amount of energy in each trophic level and the amount of energy transferred from level to level. So these pyramids are very, very important. If we look at the pyramid here, there's the pyramid, the energy pyramid. It shows us how much energy goes in, how much energy is passed to the next level, and how much energy has been lost. So the energy that goes in here is coming from the sun. And then each stage at the food chain is at trophic level. So here are the producers. Now, the producers will then be consumed by the primary consumer. So energy is transferred. The blue arrow is showing us energy transfer from producer to primary consumer. Then some energy is lost. So when the secondary consumer consumes the primary consumer, there's energy transfer and some energy lost. And when the secondary consumer is consumed by or is eaten by the tertiary consumer, energy is transferred to the tertiary consumer and some of it is lost. Some of it can be lost in the form of heat. So this is how energy is transferred from level to level, and energy pyramids help us to better understand that. Now let's move on to another activity. Now, have a look at the following energy pyramid for a marine and savanna ecosystem, and pay careful attention to the number of organisms in each level and answer the questions below. There's the two pyramids. This is the marine and the savanna. Now, Which organisms are the producers in the marine ecosystem and in the savanna ecosystem? B. 90% of the energy is lost and only 10% is made available to the next trophic level. Why do you think that happens? Why do you think that happens? Okay, give yourself 4 minutes to answer these questions. Then after 4 minutes, we will do the solutions together. See you after 4 minutes. Welcome back, grade 8. Now let's answer the questions together. Now we had to study the diagram, rather the energy pyramid for a marine and a savanna ecosystem. So the one for this marine was on this one, and the one for the savanna was this one. So pay careful attention to the number of organisms in each level and answer the questions that follow. So which organisms are the producers in the marine ecosystem and in the savanna ecosystem? Right, if you wrote trees, grass for savanna and phytoplankton for or algae for the marine, you got it correct. Don't forget to send through your answers and any questions you may have on our WhatsApp number that is at the bottom of the screen. B, 90% of the energy is lost and only 10% is made available to the next trophic level. Why do you think this happens? Right. This is because the organism, after feeding or after producing its own food, uses up to 90% of its food energy for itself. It uses it for itself, it uses it for its life processes. So that is the energy that we're saying is lost. It doesn't move on to the next trophic level. It remains in the previous trophic level. Now, only about 10% of the energy then goes on into the new body cells, and now it is available for the animal when it gets eaten. So there is how the percentages are spent. The 90 is spent with food processes and other life processes that happen. And then the 10 is what is left. Then the 10 is what is made available to the next trophic level, Okay, so I'm going to give you a quick minute to copy down the corrections, and then after the minute, we are going to continue with our lesson. Welcome back, learners. Now let's continue with our lesson. Let's learn about the food web. So far we've learned about energy flow, energy transfer, energy loss. We've learned about the energy pyramid, and we've learned about the food chains. Now we're going to learn about the food web. So consumers have different sources of food in an ecosystem and do not rely on one species for their food. This we know when we learned about when we're learning how an environment influences the stay or the availability of certain populations in that particular area. Is availability of different sources of food and not relying on one food guarantees survival for that animal. Now, when we take a lot of food chains and we group them up and we connect them, we come up with what is called a food web. This is by grouping food chains together and connecting them, then we come up with a food web. So what does the food web show? What does it represent? So food web shows the interactions one organism may have with many other organisms. Right, so there is our food chain. Now, this, if we follow the tree, if we start off with the tree, we can follow and see the number of interactions that the tree has. Or rather, we can pick up which food chains are there or how many food chains are there. We can identify different food chains within this food web. Remember, a food web is just food chains connected together just to show us that consumers have different sources of food. If we start off with the tree over here, I'm just going to point this arrow to guide you. Now, so the giraffe is our primary consumer, so it's the tree. Then the giraffe gets eaten by the lion. So that is one food chain. If we look on this side, the rhino eats the tree, and then the rhino is eaten by the lion. So in this particular case, the lion's variety menu consists of the giraffe and the rhino. So we have two food chains here. If we move on and focus on the grass, this food chain that has the primary producer as the grass. So the rhino also feeds on the grass. So it doesn't only feed on tree leaves, it also feeds on the grass. Then that rhino dies and gets devoured by a scavenger, which is the vulture. So there we go. So the rhino can be in two food chains at the same time. It can also have two food sources at the same time. Now, still on the grass. If the grass is eaten by a grasshopper, then the grasshopper is eaten by a fiscal shrike. The fiscal shrike then gets eaten by an African skunk, and then the skunk dies off and its dead body is devoured by a vulture. There is a fourth food chain. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we have 4 food chains. Let's look for more. Let's look for more food chains. So the grass gets eaten by the grasshopper, and the grasshopper gets eaten by the baboon. Then the baboon gets eaten by the leopard dies and gets devoured by the vulture. So there's food chain number 5. Let's look for more food chains. Now the grass, we start off with the grass. The grass gets eaten by the mouse. The mouse is eaten by the caracal. The caracal is eaten by the snake. The snake is eaten by the baboon. The baboon gets eaten by the leopard, and the leopard gets eaten by the vulture. There is food chain number 6. Now, next, we've got the impala. The impala eats, so the line goes all the way up there. So the impala eats the grass. Then the impala gets eaten by the leopard. The leopard gets eaten by the vulture. So there is another food chain. Then we have a shrub. The impala is the shrub. And the impala gets eaten by the leopard, and the leopard gets eaten by the vulture. So you see, it's a group of food chains. It's a group of food chains connected together to form this food chain. It also shows us the different interactions that one organism may have with many other organisms. For example, the grass is food for the rhino, food for the grasshopper, food for the mouse. And so it's food for the rhino, the grasshopper, and the mouse. The tree is food for the giraffe, and it is food for the rhino. The lion and the rhino and the giraffe, they have a predator-prey relationship. So the food webs and food chains will show you the interactions and the feeding relationships that exist between organisms in a community. Now let's do a short activity together. So you need to study the food web below and answer the questions that follow. 1. What sort of ecosystem does this food web describe? And then 2, use the following space to write down 4 different food chains from this food web. So we're going to write 4 different chains. Right. So give yourself 5 minutes to write this activity. Don't forget to send through your answers and any questions you may have to 079-578-2908. So see you after 5 minutes. Welcome back. Now let's go through the questions together. Right, what sort of ecosystem does this food web describe? It describes a marine ecosystem. How do we know it is a marine ecosystem? By the type of organisms that are in this food web. We've got a blue whale, which obviously lives in the sea, ocean. Killer whale, we've got leopard seals, we've got fish, zooplankton, phytoplankton, seaweed, squids, crabs. These are organisms that are found in a marine ecosystem. These are organisms that are found within a marine ecosystem. Okay, so now we're supposed to write down food chains, 4 different food chains from this food web. 4 different food chains from this food web. I'm pretty sure there are more than 4. Let's choose 4. Now the first one is seaweed. So this is where our starting point is. Seaweed, crab, elephant seal. So we've got seaweed, squid, seaweed, crab, squid, then elephant seal. So the elephant seal eats the squid, and then the elephant seal is eaten by the killer whale. So food chain 1, let's look for more. We'll start with seaweed again, followed by the crab, the squid. In this particular case, we're branching to the left. So the squid gets eaten by a penguin, and then the penguin is eaten by the leopard seal. The leopard seal is then eaten by the killer whale. The killer whale. Let's look for food chain number 4. We'll start off with phytoplankton. Phytoplankton is eaten by the krill, and then the krill is eaten by the blue whale. The krill is eaten by the blue whale. Then if we continue, phytoplankton to zooplankton to fish. Fish is eaten by the seagull. The seagull is eaten by the leopard seal, and the leopard seal is eaten by the killer whale. There are more food chains. You can continue looking for more food chains on that picture there at home after the lesson is concluded. So for now, take 2 minutes to copy down the corrections. Then after 2 minutes, we will wrap up our lesson. Welcome back. Now let us wrap up our lesson. What did we learn today? So in today's lesson, we learned about food chains. We learned about food chains and that they are the sequence of transfers of matter and energy in the form of food from organism to organism. So your food chain will have your primary producer, your primary consumer, your secondary consumer, and your tertiary consumer. So it basically shows you the transfer of matter and energy in the form of food from one organism to another. And then we also learned about food webs. Food webs are a bit complex, so they are complex networks of interconnecting and overlapping food chains showing feeding relationships within a community, just like the activity we just worked on now that had the marine ecosystem. We saw quite a number of overlaps and interconnecting and overlapping food chains. Remember, we picked up 4 food chains from that diagram. We could identify 4 food chains from that one diagram, with some organisms having feeding relationship more than one feeding relationships with other organisms. For example, the leopard seal. Did you see how many feeding relationships the leopard seal had? It had quite a number. We also learned about energy transfer and that it is vital because organisms, remember, they need to carry out life processes so that they don't die. So they need to carry out the life processes, and therefore energy transfer is important from producer to consumer. Energy transfer is important. And we also learned that all energy in food webs and food chains comes from the sun. The sun is our ultimate source of energy. It is our ultimate source of energy, and those arrows that are in food webs and food chains always point towards where the energy is being transferred to. They always point towards where the energy is being transferred to. That's where the energy points to. And then we learned about trophic levels. So each step within a food chain or food web is at trophic level. And we also learned that there is energy that is lost in energy flow and energy transfer. There's energy that is lost and energy that is gained when energy is transferred from one living organism to another. So what happens is an organism will use 90% of the food that it gets for its life processes, and some of that 90% will also involve energy that have been lost, maybe due to heat or energy that is lost during the life processes. So 90% of that energy is said to be lost in an energy pyramid. So now from the 90% now, other than the 90% will be lost with the 10%. So the 10% is the percentage energy that is then transferred to the next animal when the current animal, the previous animal gets eaten. That is the energy that is going to be transferred. And remember, a trophic level is a feeding level on the pyramid. It shows you, the pyramid shows you how much energy is lost, how much energy is transferred. So it is very vital. It gives us very vital information. Okay, grade 8. In our next lesson, we're going to learn about balance in ecosystems. We're going to learn about balance in ecosystems. All right. Thank you so much for joining me in today's lesson. I hope to see you in the next one. Goodbye.